Christmas had always been bittersweet for me. The cold snow, the warm lights, the smell of gingerbread, all of it masked a creeping unease that I couldn't shake. It all started when I moved back to my hometown, a small, snow blanketed village in the heart, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Every house seemed to hold secrets behind its frosted windows. I'd barely unpacked my things when I first heard it. It was late, close to midnight, and I was sitting by the fire with a cup of tea, trying to shake off the chill that seemed to seep through the old walls. Faintly, just beyond the edge of hearing, came the sound of someone singing, Silent Holy Night. It was soft and melodic, yet something about it was wrong. The voice was distorted, like an old recording played on a warped tape. It sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the snow falling heavily, erasing the world beyond the glow of the street lamp. The next morning, I asked my neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harlow, about it. Her face paled, and she gripped the edge of her door. "You heard it, didn't you?" she whispered. "Heard what?" "The singing Santa." Her words hung in the air like a curse. She quickly closed the door, muttering something about staying indoors after dark. That evening, curiosity got the better of me. I sat by the window watching the snow fall and waited. Sure enough, as the clock struck midnight, the singing began again. This time, it was louder, closer. The same distorted voice sang, but the words seemed slower, as though the singer were struggling to finish the lines. "Sleep in heavenly peace." I opened the window just a crack, and the icy wind bit into my skin. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I leaned out, scanning the empty street, when I noticed footprints in the snow. They were fresh, leading away from my house and disappearing into the woods at the edge of town. Against all better judgment, I grabbed my coat and boots and followed them. The footprints led me deep into the forest, where the snow muffled every sound except my own crunching steps. The singing grew louder as I walked, until I saw him, a figure standing in a clearing. He wore a red suit, but it was tattered and stained, and his face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that cast his features in shadow. He was holding a sack, the bottom of which dragged in the snow, leaving a dark, wet trail. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw his face, or what was left of it. His skin was gray and sunken, his eyes hollow sockets, and his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "Silent night," he rasped, his voice now clear and sickeningly human. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground as he began to walk toward me, dragging the sack behind him. It wasn't until I saw the sack writhing, as though something inside was struggling to get out, that my paralysis broke. I ran. I didn't stop until I burst out of the woods and back into the safety of my house. Locking the door behind me, I peered out the window, half expecting to see him standing in my yard, but there was nothing. Just the snow, falling heavier than before. That night, I didn't sleep. The singing didn't return, but the silence was almost worse. The next morning, I went to the town library, desperate for answers. Buried in the dusty archives, I found an old newspaper article from decades ago. The headline read, "Local man disappears in Christmas Eve blizzard. Last seen wearing Santa suit." According to the article, the man had been hired to play Santa for the town's Christmas parade, but never returned home. Search parties found no trace of him, but rumors spread that he'd frozen to death in the woods, clutching the sack of gifts meant for the children. The article ended with a chilling note. Some locals claimed to hear his voice on snowy nights, singing carols and searching for those who stray too far from home. The next night, the singing came again. This time, it was louder, closer than ever. I could hear the scrape of boots on the porch, the heavy drag of the sack. "Sleep in heavenly peace." The doorknob rattled. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and pressed my back against the wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The singing stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then came the sound of something being slipped under the door. When I finally gathered the courage to look, I found a small, wrapped gift. My name was written on the tag in shaky, uneven letters. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was an old photograph of my family, my parents, my sister, and me as a child. But something was wrong. In the background, barely visible, stood the singing Santa, his hollow eyes staring straight at the camera. That was the last night I stayed in that house. I packed my things and left the town for good. But even now, on cold December nights, I sometimes hear it. That haunting, distorted voice calling from the distance, silent, holy, and I know he's still searching. The package arrived on my doorstep on the first snow-dusted morning of December. I hadn't ordered anything, and there was no return address. The box was small, wrapped in faded Christmas paper, and tied with a crimson ribbon. The only clue to its origin was the name on the tag, for Daniel, from Michael. Michael was my older brother. He'd been missing for 7 years. I stared at the box, my chest tightening. Michael had vanished one winter without a trace. No phone calls, no letters, just gone. The police called it a probable runaway. My parents believed something darker had happened. As for me, I'd given up hope long ago. I took the package inside, setting it on the dining table. It felt unnervingly light, as if it were empty. Yet when I shook it, something faintly rattled inside. I thought about opening it, but dread held me back. How could it possibly be? The following days were restless. The package sat untouched, yet I couldn't ignore its presence. At night, I swore I could hear faint whispers coming from, though I convinced myself it was just my imagination. On the third day, I finally gave in. The paper tore easily, and underneath was a plain wooden box, smooth and polished, with no seams or hinges. My fingers brushed against a faint carving on the surface, some kind of symbol I didn't recognize, a circle with jagged lines cutting through it. I pressed on the top of the box. With a soft click, it opened. Inside was a single, ancient-looking key. The key was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was heavy, wrought iron, and cold to the touch. Its shaft was twisted, and the head was shaped like an intricate snowflake. There was no note, no explanation, just the key, lying on a bed of crimson velvet. As I held it, a strange sensation crept over me. The room seemed to dim, the air growing colder, heavier. Then, faintly, I heard it. Daniel. The voice was barely audible, yet unmistakable. It was Michael's voice. I spent the next day trying to ignore the key, but it was impossible. It felt as though it was calling to me. That night, as I sat in the living room, staring at the box, the lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, and the temperature plummeted. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the hallway. It was Michael, or at least it looked like him. He was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were dark, hollow voids. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He raised a hand and pointed to the key. I froze, my heart pounding. The figure flickered like a dying light bulb, and then it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was determined to find out what the key opened. I searched the house, testing every lock, but none fit. The answer came that evening when I stumbled upon an old photograph of my family. It was taken in front of our childhood home, a crumbling farmhouse in the countryside. In the corner of the photo, just barely visible, was the outline of a cellar door I didn't remember ever seeing. The next day, I drove to the farmhouse. Snow blanketed the fields, and the house loomed like a ghost from my past. It had been abandoned for years, the windows boarded up, the walls sagging under the weight of time. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of decay. I searched every room until I found it. The cellar door, hidden beneath a rotting rug in the kitchen. The key fit perfectly. As I turned it, a low groan echoed through the house, and the door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. The cellar was cold and damp, the walls lined with old, crumbling bricks. At the far end, illuminated by the dim beam of my flashlight, was another box. This one was larger, covered in the same strange symbols as the first. I approached it cautiously, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The box had no lock, just a heavy lid that I hesitated to lift. When I finally did, the stench of rot hit me like a wave. Inside was a tangle of bones, brittle and yellowed, tied together with red ribbons. In the center of the pile was a scrap of paper, with 2 words scrawled in Michael's handwriting, "Help me." A loud thud echoed behind me, and I spun around, my flashlight shaking. The cellar door had slammed shut. Then came the whispering. It started softly, like the rustling of leaves, but quickly grew louder, more insistent. It was Michael's voice, overlapping with others, voices I didn't recognize, all pleading, crying, begging. Help us. Release us. The air grew impossibly cold, and I could see my breath swirling in the dim light. Shadows began to shift and coalesce around me, taking on twisted, human-like shapes. Daniel! One of them rasped, stepping closer. Its form was fragmented, its face half-formed, but its voice was unmistakably Michael's. You have to finish it. You have to break the chain. Before I could respond, the shadows surged forward, their icy grip pulling me toward the box. I tried to resist, but their strength was overwhelming. They forced my hands into the pile of bones, and as my fingers touched the ribbons, the symbols on the box began to glow, pulsating with an eerie red light. Destroy it, Michael's voice commanded. Burn it all. With trembling hands, I tore the ribbons from the bones. The whispers turned to screams deafening and raw. The cellar shook, the walls cracking as I yanked the bones free, scattering them across the floor. I struck a match, dropping it onto the pile. The flames roared to life, unnatural and green, consuming the box and its contents in seconds. When the fire died out, the cellar was silent. The shadows were gone and the air felt lighter, almost warm. I climbed the stairs, emerging into the faint light of dawn. As I stepped outside, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. I never saw Michael, but I knew, somehow, that he was free. The house burned to the ground then, leaving nothing but ashes and snow. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of December, I still hear whispers, and I wonder if I truly destroyed the chain, or if I've simply passed it on to someone else. It was a tradition in our small town. Every December, the residents would string up Christmas lights on their homes. The town would shine like a jewel in the snow, and people would come from miles around to see the dazzling display. My parents' house had always been part of it, with the biggest and brightest lights on the block. This year, after my parents moved to Florida, I inherited the house. It had been years since I'd come home for Christmas, but I wanted to honor the tradition. I dug out the old boxes of lights and decorations from the attic, smiling at the memories they brought back. That's when I found it. At the bottom of one box, hidden beneath tangled strands of colored lights, was a single strand I didn't recognize. The bulbs were a strange shade of red, almost blood-colored, and the wire was a dull, tarnished copper. There was no plug, just a set of frayed wires at the end. For a moment, I considered tossing it, but something about the lights drew me in. They felt important, like they belonged here. That night, I strung the strange lights across the front of the house. When I stepped back to admire my work, I noticed how the red lights seemed to pulse faintly, as though they were alive. I chalked it up to a trick of the eye and went to bed. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of faint tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind against the windows, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was coming from the front of the house. I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. The street was empty, the snow undisturbed, but the red bulbs were glowing brighter now, casting an eerie, flickering light that made the shadows on the lawn look like they were moving. The next day, I asked the neighbor, Mrs. Wilkes, about the lights. She'd lived on the street for decades and knew everything about the town. Her face paled when I described them. "You didn't use them, did you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why? What's wrong with them?" "Those lights belong to the Hargrove family," I whispered, glancing nervously toward my house. The Hargroves had lived in my house long before my parents bought it. According to Mrs. Wilkes, they were known for their Christmas display, elaborate, beautiful, and always featuring the same strand of red lights. But one year, the lights began flickering strangely. Neighbors reported seeing shadows moving inside the house, even though the Hargroves weren't home. Then, on Christmas Eve, the entire family vanished. The police found no signs of a struggle, no evidence of where they'd gone. All that remained were the lights, still glowing faintly on the house. My stomach twisted as Mrs. Wilkes told me the story, but I brushed it off as superstition. Still, that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. At midnight, the tapping returned. Louder this time, more insistent. I turned on every light in the house, but the tapping didn't stop. It seemed to follow me, growing louder as I moved through the rooms. Finally, I flung open the front door, expecting to find some prankster, but the porch was empty. The snow was untouched. Then, I noticed the lights. The red bulbs were no longer flickering. Instead, they were glowing steadily, casting an unnatural light that painted the snow in deep crimson. The shadows they cast were wrong, elongated, twisting in impossible ways. And then they moved. One by one, the shadows detached from the lights, sliding across the snow like liquid. They pooled together at the base of the porch, rising up into a humanoid shape. Its face was featureless, but I felt its gaze boring and, "Why are you here?" It rasped, its voice low and guttural. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. For hours, I sat in the dark, clutching a baseball bat, listening to the sounds outside. The tapping was replaced by scraping, as though something sharp was dragging across the siding. When dawn finally broke, the noises stopped. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see the shadowy figure still waiting for me. But the porch was empty and the lights had gone dark. I decided to take them down immediately. As I pulled them from the house, I noticed something strange. The bulbs were hot to the touch, even though they hadn't been plugged in. The wire felt heavier than it should, and when I looked closer, I saw it wasn't copper at all. It was rusted metal, crusted with something dark and flaking, something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. I threw the lights into the trash, but they didn't stay there for long. That night, I heard a strange humming sound coming from the attic. When I went to investigate, I found the lights strung up along the rafters, glowing faintly. Panicked, I grabbed a pair of scissors and cut through the wire. As soon as I did, the house went completely dark and the temperature dropped. The shadows seemed to thicken, pressing in around me. Then I heard it, a chorus of whispers, low and overlapping, coming from every direction. "You can't break the chain. You can't escape." I ran from the house and didn't look back. The next day, I sold the property to a developer. I don't know what happened to the lights, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I drive past the old neighborhood, I see a faint red glow coming from the windows, and I wonder if the Hargroves ever truly left, or if I've merely joined the long line of people cursed by the Christmas lights. It started as a simple family tradition. Every Christmas, my younger sister Lily and I would build a snowman in our backyard. We'd dress it up with a scarf, an old hat, and a carrot for the nose. This year, with the first snowfall blanketing the ground, we decided to make the biggest snowman yet. The sky was a dull gray, and the air felt heavier than usual, but Lily's excitement was contagious. Together, we rolled massive balls of snow and stacked them carefully. The snowman towered over us by the time we finished, its round face gazing blankly toward the house. "Wait here," Lily said, running inside. She returned with a pair of mismatched buttons for the eyes and an old scarf. I added a carrot nose and a stick smile, stepping back to admire our work. "There," I said, "perfect." But as we headed inside, I glanced back. For just a moment, I could have sworn the snowman's head was tilted, as if it were watching us. That night, the wind howled against the windows, and the temperature dropped even further. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I peeked through my window, my breath fogging the glass. The backyard was bathed in the pale glow of the moon, and the snowman stood exactly where we'd left it. But something was different. The smile we had carefully shaped was gone, replaced by a gaping frown. The next morning, I tried to shake off my unease. Snow can shift overnight, I told myself. The wind probably moved the sticks, but Lily noticed it too. "Did you change the snowman?" she asked, tilting her head. "No." She shrugged and ran off to play. I stayed behind, staring at the snowman. Its button eyes seemed darker now, more recessed, and the scarf we'd tied around its neck had fallen loose, hanging like a noose. I adjusted the scarf and reshaped its smile before heading inside. That night, I heard the crunching again. This time, it was louder, closer. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, heart pounding. The snowman was gone. The spot where it had stood was just a circle of flattened snow. My stomach twisted as I scanned the yard. Then I saw it. The snowman was standing closer to the house, just beneath my window. Its head was tilted back, staring directly at me. I bolted downstairs, determined to prove to myself that it was just my imagination. I threw on my coat and stepped into the freezing night, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The snowman was larger up close, its shadow looming over me in the moonlight. The buttons that made up its eyes were gone, leaving deep, hollow sockets that seemed to bore into my soul. I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to crumble under my hand. But the snow was firm, almost solid, and ice cold. Then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from somewhere deep inside the snowman. "Cold, so cold." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was a chorus of voices, overlapping and pleading. "Let us in, let us in." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the snowman's hollow sockets and hear the whisper. By morning, the snowman had moved again, now standing near the back porch. I begged my parents to let me destroy it, but they laughed it off. "It's just a snowman," my dad said, ruffling my hair. Lily was less amused. "It's creepy," she muttered, tugging on my sleeve. "I don't like it." Neither did I. That evening, I waited until everyone was asleep. Armed with a shovel, I marched into the yard, determined to destroy the snowman once and for all. But as I raised the shovel, the air around me grew colder. My breath froze in the air, and the whispers returned, louder this. "Don't! Stop!" The snow around the snowman shifted, and I froze as long, spindly arms emerged from its sides, made entirely of packed ice and snow. The smile on its face reappeared, but it was twisted now, wide and jagged. Before I could react, one of the arms lashed out, knocking the shovel from my hands. I stumbled back, falling into the snow. The snowman loomed over me, its head tilting unnaturally as it leaned closer. "You made me," it hissed, its voice sharp and grating. "You can't undo me." I scrambled to my feet and ran inside, slamming the door behind me. The whispers followed me, growing louder, echoing through the house. The next morning, the snowman was gone. The yard was untouched, as if it had never been there. But I knew better. Every winter, I feel it watching. No matter where I go, I see its shape in the distance, standing silently in the snow. And every Christmas, the whispers return, growing louder, reminding me that some creations can't be undone. Growing up, Christmas at my grandmother's house was always magical. She had a knack for making the holiday feel warm and special, with her crackling fireplace, twinkling lights, and the mountain of presents she'd painstakingly wrap. But there was one tradition that always stood out: her wrapping paper. Every year she'd use the same pattern, ornate vintage paper with deep crimson swirls and gold accents. It was old-fashioned and beautiful, but there was something about it that unsettled me. Maybe it was the strange, almost organic way the swirls twisted, like veins running through the paper. After she passed away last year, I inherited her house. Cleaning out her belongings was bittersweet, and when I found a box of that familiar wrapping paper in the attic, I felt a pang of nostalgia. Despite my unease, I decided to honor her tradition and use the paper to wrap my gifts. The first gift I wrapped was my younger brother, Jamie. As I smoothed the paper over the box, I noticed something odd. The texture of the paper wasn't quite right. Too rough, almost leathery. But when I ran my fingers over it again, it felt normal. I chalked it up to my imagination and finished wrapping. That night, I placed the gift under the tree, along with a few others I'd wrapped. The crimson and gold stood out sharply against the other, more modern pattern. At some point during the night, I woke up to a faint rustling sound. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled into the living room, thinking the cat had gotten into the gifts. But the room was empty, except for the wrapped present. The one I'd wrapped in the vintage paper was no longer under the tree. It was in the middle of the room, the edges of the paper curling slightly, as if it had been moved, or had moved itself. The next morning, I told Jamie about it, but he just laughed it off. "You're probably just stressed," he said. "It's just wrapping paper." But as the week went on, more strange things started happening. The gifts I wrapped in that paper wouldn't stay where I left them. I'd find them in random places, the kitchen counter, the hallway, even once on my bed. At first, I thought someone was playing a prank, but when I checked the security footage from the camera I'd installed in the living room, my blood ran cold. The footage showed the wrapped gifts shifting on their own, sliding across the floor like something was pulling them. At one point, the paper seemed to ripple, almost like it was breathing. I decided to stop using the paper, but when I went to throw it out, the roll was gone. I searched the house from top to bottom, but it was nowhere to be found. That night, I woke up to the sound of Jamie screaming. I ran to his room and found him sitting up in bed, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It was in here," he gasped. "What was?" "The wrapping paper," he whispered. "It was watching me." The next day, I went through every box in the attic, desperate to find the source of this nightmare. That's when I found an old journal of my grandmother. Flipping through the yellowed pages, I found an entry dated decades ago. I didn't mean to take it. The shopkeeper told me it was special, that it had a history, but I thought he was just trying to sell me something. I only realized the truth after I started using it. The paper, it's alive. It watches, it waits, and it takes. The entry ended abruptly, followed by several pages that had been violently torn out. That night, I burned every gift I'd wrapped in that cursed paper. I stood in the backyard, watching the flames consume the crimson and gold. For a moment, I thought it was over. But as the last embers died, I noticed something horrifying. The paper didn't burn like normal. It twisted and curled, releasing an acrid, almost metallic smell. And for a split second, I thought I saw shapes writhing in the flames. When I went back inside, the roll of wrapping paper was sitting on the kitchen table, completely untouched. Now, every Christmas, I see it. The paper appears in random places, tucked under the tree, folded neatly in a drawer, or laid out on the table as if daring me to use it. I've tried destroying it, burying it, even leaving it miles away, but it always comes back. And each year, the whispers grow louder, echoing in the stillness of the night. Wrap with, wrap with. I don't know how much longer I. When I was a kid, Christmas in our neighborhood always meant carolers. Groups would wander from house to house, singing festive tunes. It was something we all looked forward to. The warm sound of voices cutting through the cold night air. The joy it brought to every doorstep. This year, however, it was different. It was late on Christmas Eve when I heard the knock at my door. I had stayed up wrapping gifts and was surprised anyone was still out. Peeking through the window, I saw a single caroler standing on my porch. He wore a tattered coat and an old-fashioned hat, and his face was hidden in shadow. In his gloved hands, he clutched a weathered songbook. Before I could open the door, he started singing. His voice was deep, gravelly, and uncomfortably slow. He wasn't singing any carol I recognized. His words were guttural, foreign, and strangely rhythmic. It wasn't festive. It was wrong. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Something about him filled me with an inexplicable dread. Finally, I called out, "I'm sorry, it's late. Maybe try another house." The singing stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, he spoke. "One song," he said, his voice hoarse but deliberate. "Just one." Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack. "I don't think—" He looked up then, and my words died in my throat. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were wrong. They were sunken, hollow, and seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim porch light. His mouth twisted into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just one song," he repeated. I shook my head and closed the door. I stood there for him, my heart pounding, listening. The singing started again, louder this time, reverberating through the walls. I moved to the window to tell him to leave, but when I looked out, the porch was empty. The caroler was gone. Relieved, I turned off the lights and went upstairs, trying to shake the unease that clung to me. But as I climbed into bed, I heard it again, the singing. It wasn't coming from the porch this time, it was closer, inside the house. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The melody was faint, echoing through the halls, and the words were clearer now. They weren't English, but the tone was mournful, almost accusatory. Gripping a flashlight, I crept downstairs. The living room was empty, the front door locked. Yet the singing grew louder, coming from the direction of the fireplace. I shone the flashlight into the dark, empty hearth. The light caught something, a face. It was him, staring out from the blackness, his mouth twisted into that same unnatural smile. His eyes locked onto mine, and his lips moved silently, singing a song only he could hear. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling to the floor. By the time I looked again, the fireplace was empty, but the singing didn't stop. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of my room with every light on, listening to the haunting melody echo through the house. The next morning, I thought it was over. The house was silent, and sunlight streamed through the windows, chasing away the night's terror. But as I stepped outside to grab the morning paper, I saw something on the porch, the weathered songbook. I called the police, desperate for answers. They didn't find anything, no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow, nothing. The songbook, they said, was probably a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the caroler wasn't done with me. That night, as I lay in bed, the singing returned, louder, angrier, and this time there were more voices, overlapping in dissonant harmony. I tried to escape, leaving the house and staying with a friend for a few nights, but no matter where I went, the singing followed me. On Christmas night, I awoke to find the songbook on the bedside table. Its pages were open, the words written in a language I couldn't understand, the ink smeared as though someone had been crying over it. And scrawled at the bottom of the page, in jagged, trembling letters, was a message: "You didn't let me finish." I've moved 3 times since that Christmas, but it doesn't matter. Every year on Christmas Eve, the singing starts again. It's louder now, more insistent, and every year I feel it getting closer. My Aunt Clara had always been eccentric, collecting strange antiques and knickknacks from thrift stores and estate sales. Her house was cluttered with oddities, but one thing always stood out: a porcelain Christmas doll. The doll was about 2 feet tall, with rosy cheeks, bright blue eyes, and a crimson dress trimmed with white lace. It held a tiny golden bell in one hand, its painted lips curled into a sweet but unsettling smile. Every Christmas, Aunt Clara would place the doll on her mantle, claiming it brought good luck. "She's been in the family for years," she'd say, "and she watches over us during the holidays." Last year, when Aunt Clara passed away, she left the doll to me. I wasn't thrilled about it had always given me the creeps, but I didn't have the heart to throw it away. This Christmas, I decided to honor Clara's memory and put the doll on my living room shelf. As soon as I did, the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift. It felt heavier, like the air was pressing down on me. I told myself it was just my imagination and went about decorating. But that night, as I sat by the fireplace, I noticed something strange. The doll's eyes seemed to glimmer in the firelight, almost as if they were moving. I chalked it up to a trick of the light and headed to bed. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard a faint jingling sound, like a bell being rung softly. I froze, listening. The sound was coming from the living room. I peeked downstairs, expecting to see the cat playing with something, but the room was empty. The doll, however, had changed. Its head, which had been tilted slightly to the left, was now straight, its unblinking eyes staring directly at the stairs. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, and I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. At one point, as I was wrapping presents, the jingling started again. This time it was louder, coming from just behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The doll's bell, however, was swaying gently in its porcelain hand, as if someone had just rung it. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamt of the doll, its painted smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, glassy teeth. It moved jerkily, like a puppet on strings, its tiny bell ringing with each step. When I woke up, the doll wasn't on the shelf. It was sitting on the edge of my bed. Terrified, I grabbed the doll and stuffed it in a box, locking it in the basement. But even then, I couldn't escape it. The jingling followed me everywhere, soft, persistent, like a mocking reminder that I couldn't get rid of it. The final straw came on Christmas Eve. I was wrapping gifts late at night when I heard the sound of small footsteps, accompanied by the faint ringing of the bell. My heart raced as I turned around. The doll was standing in the doorway. It wasn't sitting, it was standing. Its porcelain face was cracked now, with jagged lines running across its cheeks, but its smile was wider than ever. The bell in its hand swung violently, the ringing growing louder and louder until it was deafening. I grabbed the fireplace poker and swung at the doll, shattering it into pieces. The sound of the bell stopped, and for a moment, the house was silent. Relieved, I swept up the fragments and threw them into the trash outside. But when I returned to the house, the air felt wrong. The lights flickered, and the faint smell of burning filled the room. And then I heard it, the bell. It was coming from the mantel. The doll was there, completely intact, its blue eyes shining brightly in the dim light. I left the house that night and never went back. But every Christmas, no matter where I am, I hear it, the faint, persistent jingling of a tiny golden bell. And I know it's watching, waiting for me to come home. The winter of 1998 was one of the coldest I can remember. The snowdrifts reached higher than my knees, and the small town where I lived felt like it was encased in ice. That year, I volunteered to help set up the town's Christmas Eve service in the old church at the edge of town, a place that held both charm and unease, its ancient stone walls. The church had a haunting reputation. People whispered stories about how, decades ago, a group of carolers had gone missing after performing there during a blizzard. According to the legend, their voices could still be heard on stormy nights, carried by the wind. I never believed those tales. That is, until that Christmas Eve. The storm rolled in earlier than expected, whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy. By the time I arrived at the church, the power had gone out, and the flickering candles inside barely illuminated the darkened nave. I was alone, tasked with setting up chairs and lighting the candelabras. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the howling wind outside. Then, faintly, I heard it, singing. It was distant, melodic, and chillingly beautiful. The notes floated through the air, harmonized in an otherworldly way. For a moment, I thought it was the choir arriving early. But when I stepped outside, the snow-covered street was empty. As I returned to my work, the singing grew louder. It echoed through the church, filling the vast, empty space with haunting melodies. I called out, but no one responded. That's when I noticed the temperature. The church, which had been cold but tolerable, now felt unbearably frigid. My breath hung in the air, and frost began to creep along the edges of the windows. I decided to investigate, following the sound of the singing. It seemed to be coming from the choir loft. The stairs leading to the loft were narrow and creaky, and each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the top, the air was so cold it burned my lungs. The loft was empty, but the singing was deafening now. It surrounded me as if the voices were circling, unseen. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, figures, faint and translucent, standing in the shadows. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless. Their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, singing a hymn I didn't recognize. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I managed to whisper. The figures turned their heads toward me in unison, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. The song changed, the melody twisting into something dissonant and wrong. I fled down the stairs, the chilling notes following me. The candles in the church flickered wildly, their flames shrinking as the air grew colder. When I reached the main hall, the door slammed shut behind me, and the singing stopped abruptly. I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But the silence didn't last. A single voice began to hum. It was soft at first, coming from the altar. Then another voice joined in, and another, until the entire church was filled with the frozen choir. The figures began to appear again, emerging from the shadows, their forms more defined now. Their faces were frozen in eerie smiles, and their eyes glistened with a malevolent light. I backed away, but the air felt heavy, as if the cold itself was holding me in place. The lead figure stepped forward, holding out a hand. His skin was gray and cracked, like ice ready to shatter. "You have heard our song," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Join us." I shook my head, my breath catching in my throat. I can't." The smile faded from his face, replaced by something darker. The air around me grew even colder, and frost began to form on my... In a desperate attempt to escape, I grabbed one of the candelabras and swung it toward the figure. The flame sputtered but didn't go out, and the ghostly form recoiled, hissing. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, throwing open the heavy doors and plunging into the storm. The singing followed me all the way home, growing fainter with each step but never fully disappearing. That night, I couldn't sleep. The melody replayed in my mind, its haunting beauty and chilling undertone etched into my memory. The next morning, I returned to the church with a group of townspeople. The storm had passed, but the building was eerily quiet. Inside, everything was as I'd left it, except for one thing. On the altar lay a single sheet of old, yellowed music, the title written in an elegant hand, The Frozen Hymn. I burned it that afternoon, but I know it didn't matter. Even now, on cold, snowy nights, I can hear the faint strains of their song, and I know they're waiting for me to return and finish what they started. I was spending Christmas alone last year. It wasn't by choice. My family was stuck across the country due to a massive snowstorm, and my friends all had their own plans. I decided to make the best of it, cozying up with a few holiday movies and a bottle of wine in my small rural cabin. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling and snow piling up against the windows. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, so I didn't expect any visitors. That's why I was startled when I heard the knock at the window. It wasn't a soft tap, it was sharp, deliberate, and completely out of place in the middle of the storm. I froze, the sound sending a chill down my spine. Slowly, I turned toward the window. At first, I couldn't see anything through the frost-covered glass, but then, a shadow moved. Someone was out there. I hesitated, debating whether to investigate. The knock came again, louder this time. Gathering my courage, I approached the window and wiped away the frost with trembling fingers. A man stood outside, his face pale and half hidden by a hood. His eyes were wide and wild, and his breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer. "Please," he said, his voice muffled by the wind. "Let me in." Something about him didn't sit right with me. His clothes were dry, despite the raging storm, and his expression was off, desperate yet unnervingly calm. "I'm sorry," I called through the glass. "I can't let you in. There's a storm shelter down the road." He didn't move. Instead, he pressed his hand against the window, leaving a print that seemed to linger even after he pulled it away. "Please," he repeated, his voice lower now, almost pleading. I backed away, unease twisting in my gut. When I turned back to the window, he was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Moments later, I heard a faint scratching sound, this time at the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached, my heart pounding. The door was locked, but the scratching continued, persistent and deliberate. When I shone the flashlight through the small window on the door, I saw nothing. Then, the scratching stopped. I turned to head back to the living room, but I froze mid-step. The man was now standing outside the sliding glass door, his face pressed against the glass. His hood had fallen back, revealing pale, waxy skin and hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. His mouth was moving, but no sound came. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me someone would come, but in this storm, it would take time. The next hour was pure terror. The man moved around the cabin, knocking on windows and doors, his silent presence an unrelenting threat. At one point, I heard a thud on the roof, followed by the sound of footsteps overhead. I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching a heavy flashlight as my only weapon. Outside, the wind howled, but underneath it, I could still hear him, his voice faint but clear, calling my name. When the police finally arrived, the man was gone. They found footprints in the snow leading to the cabin, but none leading away. The officers searched the property and surrounding woods, but found no sign of him. They assured me it was likely a vagrant seeking shelter, but their words did little to ease my fear. The next morning, as I cleaned up the mess from the night before, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the frosted glass of the living room window, written in a shaky, finger-drawn scrawl, was a message. "You're lucky this time. I haven't spent Christmas alone since. Even now, whenever the snow falls heavily, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for another chance." It was Christmas Eve when I bought the mirror. I'd been looking for something to complete the decor in my new apartment, something elegant to hang above the fireplace. I didn't expect to find anything so perfect at an estate sale, but there it was, an old ornate mirror, framed in dark, polished wood, with intricate carvings of angels and stars. The glass had a cloudy quality to it, as though it had seen years of use. I was drawn to it immediately. The seller told me the mirror had been in his family for generations, passed down every Christmas. "It's said to bring luck to the household," he explained with a cryptic smile. "But be careful. Don't look at it too long on Christmas Eve." I laughed it off, thinking it was just a quirky old superstition. After all, it was just a mirror. I hung it above the mantel as soon as I got home. The room felt instantly different, warmer, more inviting, but also unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. The mirror seemed to have a life of its own, casting long, eerie reflections across the walls, no matter how I angled the light. As the evening progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching me. Every time I glanced at it, I saw strange movement in the glass, shadows that didn't belong to anything in the room. I tried to ignore it, turning on Christmas music and preparing dinner, but something about the way the mirror seemed to draw my gaze back made me uneasy. As midnight approached, I sat down by the fireplace, a glass of wine in hand, trying to relax. That's when I noticed the change. The reflection in the mirror was no longer just the room. It was different. There was something moving inside it, something alive. A figure stood in the reflection, half shrouded in shadows. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but the figure was clear now, tall, slender, with a pale face that seemed to be watching me. It wore an old-fashioned coat, its sleeves hanging in tatters. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the mirror didn't move at first. It just stood there, staring. Then it smiled, a twisted, unnerving smile that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. I looked away, but when I looked back, it was closer, standing right in front of me. I stood up, backing away slowly, my hand instinctively reaching for my phone. But when I glanced at the screen, the reflection in the mirror was gone. My breath came in a shallow gasp, and I ran out of the room, leaving the mirror behind. The next morning, I cautiously returned to the living room, expecting everything to be normal again. But when I looked at the mirror, I froze. The reflection showed me, sitting in front of the fireplace, exactly as I had been the night before. But this time, the figure was beside me. It was standing just over my shoulder, its face twisted in that same terrifying grin. I rushed to the mirror, but when I looked at my own reflection, nothing was there. The room was empty. As Christmas Day passed, the strange occurrences only grew worse. Each time I glanced into the mirror, I saw more of the figure. First, its hand reaching toward me, then its hollow eyes, then its full body standing behind me, as if it had stepped out of the glass itself. By the end of the day, I couldn't look at it. I moved the mirror into the bedroom, hoping that would stop the strange, creeping presence. But every time I closed my eyes to sleep, I could feel it watching me from across the room. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft noise, scraping as though something was dragging across the floor. I turned on the light and saw something I will never forget. The mirror was in the center of the room, facing me. The glass was cracked, a jagged line running through the middle, and in the reflection I could see it, standing just beyond the mirror's frame, the figure grinning wider than ever. It stepped forward, its face pressed against the glass, and then it reached through. I screamed and backed away, but the figure didn't stop. It pulled itself out of the mirror, its hand reaching toward me with an unnatural speed. I couldn't escape. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. With nowhere else to go, I grabbed the mirror and hurled it out the window. It shattered on the ground below, but the figure, its eyes burning through the fragments, stayed with me. It's been a year since that night. The mirror's gone, but I can still feel its presence. Every time I look into any reflective surface, whether it's a window, a glass, or a car mirror, I see the figure lurking just out of the corner of my eye, and I know it's waiting for me to look again. I had always loved Christmas. The lights, the tree, the smell of pine. It was my favorite time of year. So when I moved into my new apartment, I was determined to make it perfect for the holidays. I went all out, buying the biggest tree I could find, complete with sparkling ornaments, tinsel, and a bright star on top. But what I didn't know was that this tree wasn't just a decoration, it was a trap. The night after I set up the tree, I noticed something strange. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker in the lights, like the tree was winking at me. But the next evening, when I came home after work, the lights were dim, flickering sporadically. I thought it was just a faulty bulb, but when I tried to fix it, I felt a coldness emanating from the tree. It was strange because the apartment had been warm, but the closer I got to the tree, the colder the air became. I shook it off as my imagination running wild and decided to grab a drink to calm down. But as I turned my back to the tree, I swore I heard a whisper. "Help me!" I froze, the glass still in my hand. It was so quiet, I wondered if I had just imagined it. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me, it's not over." I turned around, my heart racing. The tree stood there, perfectly still, the ornaments shimmering softly in the dim light. I walked over, feeling uneasy. As I reached out to touch one of the branches, the whispering stopped. For a moment, I thought I had been imagining it, but when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tree wasn't just an ordinary tree, it was covered in small, dark symbols, etched into the bark. They were barely noticeable, like scratches, but they were there. My hand shook as I traced one of the symbols with my finger. The moment I touched it, the temperature in the room dropped even further. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint whispers, like voices coming from the tree itself. The lights flickered again, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to move with a life of their own. Then I heard it, scratching. It was coming from the tree, like something was trying to break free from within. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding in my chest. The tree stood tall and still, but the scratching grew louder, more frantic. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was inside. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and approached the tree cautiously. The scratching intensified, as if something inside was clawing to get out. I started cutting into the bark, the blade slicing through the wood with an unnatural ease. When I finally pulled a large piece of bark away, I gasped. There was a face pressed against the inside of the tree. A twisted, contorted face, pale and lifeless, with wide, bulging eyes and a grotesque grin. It was as if the tree had grown around it, trapping it inside. The face was frozen in a silent scream, and its eyes seemed to follow me as I backed away. Panicked, I tried to tear the rest of the tree apart, but the more I cut, the stronger the cold grew. The room was freezing now, and I could see my breath in the air. I heard another whisper, louder this time, closer. "Let me out!" It wasn't just the tree speaking anymore. The voice was inside my head, echoing through every corner of my mind. The face inside the tree began to move, its mouth opening wide, and a long, skeletal hand reached out, emerging from the bark. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the hand grasped my wrist with a cold, vice-like grip. The voice laughed, a low, menacing sound that filled the room. Too late. I wrenched my arm free, running toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, the tree shook violently, its branches moving like arms, blocking the doorway. The face inside the tree grinned wider, its mouth stretching unnaturally. The tree seemed to pulse with life, the air thick with dread. The whispers became screams, echoing in every corner of the apartment. I knew I had to get out, but no matter how hard I tried, the tree wouldn't let me go. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed the bottle of vodka I had left on the counter and poured it over the tree, hoping it would do something. I grabbed a match and lit it, throwing the flame onto the branches. The fire roared to life, engulfing the tree in seconds. But as the flames consumed the tree, the face inside twisted in agony, its eyes locking onto mine, and the room was filled with the sound of its tortured scream. I woke up the next morning in the hospital. I don't know how I got there, but the doctors told me I'd been found unconscious on the floor of my apartment, my skin frostbitten and my body covered in scratches. When they asked me what happened, I couldn't bring myself to explain. I never told them about the tree or the face. I left the apartment, abandoning everything inside. I don't even know where the tree went or if it ever really existed. But I do know one thing. It's out there. And every year, as Christmas approaches, I can feel it watching me, waiting to come back. It was Christmas Eve and I was alone. My family had always gathered for the holidays, but this year things were different. I had moved to a small town for work, far away from home, and I couldn't make it back for Christmas. I wasn't upset. I'd grown used to spending time alone. But something about this Christmas felt off from the moment I woke up. I spent the day cleaning and decorating my tiny apartment. A small tree sat in the corner of the living room, covered in lights and ornaments, but the cheer was missing. As night fell and the snow began to fall heavily outside, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The town was picturesque, the snow blanketing the cobblestone streets and the lamp posts, casting soft golden light through the haze of falling flakes. It was like something out of a postcard, but there was a strange heaviness in the air. That's when I saw him. Standing at the end of the street, just past the corner, was a man. He was tall and thin, his figure draped in a long coat, his face obscured by the darkness. He didn't seem to be moving, just standing there, still and silent. At first, I thought he was a passerby, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. His presence seemed unnatural, like he didn't belong in the scene at all. I paused, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to cross the street and avoid him, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a few steps closer, and as I did, I noticed something even more unsettling. The closer I got to him, the more I felt as if he was pulling me in, like he was drawing me toward him with some invisible force. I stopped just a few feet away from him, the cold air biting at my skin. He didn't move or acknowledge my presence, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, he took a slow, deliberate step toward me. His movements were unnerving, stiff, mechanical, like someone who hadn't moved in years and was now trying to remember how. Then, without a word, he reached out a hand, his long fingers grazing my arm. The cold that emanated from him was unlike anything I'd ever felt. Colder than the winter air, colder than the snow around us. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones, freezing you from the inside out. I jerked away, my heart pounding. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And that's when I noticed the true horror of the man standing before me. His eyes, or rather, the lack of them. His face was hollow, his features an empty, dark void. There was no skin, no expression, just a gaping blackness where his eyes should have been. It was as if he had been carved out, as though he had never been fully human to begin with. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, but I could feel him following me. His presence loomed behind me, the sound of his footsteps dragging behind me in the snow. My heart raced, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster, but it felt like no matter how far I ran, I could never escape. I finally reached my apartment building, slamming the door behind me. I pressed my back against it, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I locked the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for me to slip up. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that I had just imagined it, that it was just the stress of the holidays getting to me. But that night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind made my skin crawl. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, more menacing. The next morning, Christmas Day, I went to the window, hoping to see the streets covered in snow, filled with people celebrating and spreading holiday cheer. But when I looked out, I froze. The man was standing across the street, right in front of my building, staring up at my window. His face was still empty, still hollow, but this time he was smiling. And as I watched, he began to walk toward the building. I never saw him again after that. I moved to a different town shortly after, trying to forget the horror of that Christmas. But every year, as the holidays approach, I feel a cold chill creep into the air. I never know if it's just the winter weather or something else, something much darker and colder, waiting for me to remember. And sometimes when I'm alone, I can feel him just out of sight, lurking in the shadows.